Welcome back to Media7, where I'm discussing prurience and the press with David Cohen, Mary Lambie and Professor John Burrows. John, your report via the Law Commission, of course, isn't the only new report out there at the moment. The BSA, Broadcasting Standards Authority, has a new one reviewing its privacy decisions by Nicola Morum. We've spoken to media lawyers about both reports. They're philosophical about your one. They tend to be spinning tacks about the BSA one, which does look to argue for quite a sweeping restriction of the ability to film someone in a public place.
Well, let's just say we're talking about two different things. We in the Law Commission are just concerned with how the courts apply the privacy laws. Nicole and the BSA are concerned with broadcasting standards, and they don't have in fact to overlap, but they can be different. But the real question, which is relevant to both, I suppose, is how wrong is it to film somebody in a public place when they don't know they're being filmed? And the law sort of takes a fairly robust view about this and says that provided it's not, what you film is not offensive to an ordinary person, then it's okay. I think Nicole Morum's view would be that it should be a little more restrictive than that. And even if people are in a public place where they are taking a bit of a risk as to what they do, there can be situations then where they shouldn't be followed around and filmed. And as I say, she's talking about the BSA standards and not about the law which is applied in the courts. So there can be a slight difference.
She seems to put a much greater weight on privacy than on the public interest, which is what journalists will often argue when they do something like this, when they surveil someone. What do you make of that balance?
Well, public interest has always been hard to define. And in the latest court cases, they don't use that term. They use the term legitimate public concern, which means it's not something the public is just titillated by or curious about. It's something which society ought really to learn from and be interested in. And that's quite a difficult distinction to draw, I can tell you.
Could you get any grayer?
Yeah, can it get any grayer?
That idea of legitimate public concern didn't seem to feature in the case that always comes up when these issues are discussed, which is Hosking versus Runting, which is Mike Hosking attempting to prevent pictures of his children that have been taken by freelance PAP being shown. Why is that case considered so important? I keep reading the phrase new tort of privacy. What happened there?
Well, it was a quite dramatic move. For about 20 years, our courts have been saying there might be such a thing as a tort of invasion of privacy. And judges don't normally make law quite as dramatically as that. But after that had been said for about 20 years, people started to believe it. And in Hosking and Runting, the Court of Appeal said by the narrowest majority, 3-2, yes, there is indeed such a tort in New Zealand. And if you publish private facts about somebody in a way which is highly offensive to an ordinary person, you can be sued for it. And you can get an injunction, maybe, or you can get damages. And
yet, in that case itself, Hosking didn't get satisfaction, did he?
And that's an interesting one too, because the picture there involved, of course, two young children, about a year old, being pushed in a buggy on a public street. And the court felt that that was not highly offensive. These were just little kiddies in a public place where anybody could see them. Hard to see what damage it could do. So they said, on the facts, no problem, but there's a wider principle here, which they then articulated. So it was quite an interesting decision. It's the court making law, really.
The interesting thing, Mary and David, that this also happened to John Campbell some years ago. It went quite a different way, and in fact the Women's Weekly who had bought the pictures ended up giving them back to John Campbell because it appeared he had the moral high ground because he hadn't done the women's magazines. Do you think that, is there that element of a moral high ground?
It sounds all very civil, but I wouldn't necessarily expect that in the future. I think the ante is being upped, and to give it another 10 years, it's going to be dog eats dog. It's survival of the toughest.
Are you disturbed by the idea that there are these professionals circulating? They're not working for any of the magazines, so there's some plausible deniability, and they will be taking photos of people's children. Whether they're published or not, these people will be taking photos of people's children. How do you feel about that?
Oh, of course it doesn't rest easy, and possibly indirectly that might be one of the reasons I got out of the game, when my children were, literally infants. Because, would I necessarily want to expose my children to that sort of undue attention when they're of a cognizant age, when they can start asking questions about who's the dude in the Corolla with the big lens and, what'd you do that for, mum or dad, or that sort of thing. So maybe get out of the game if you don't want potentially for that to happen to your children.
As a Wellingtonian and by definition something of a media junkie, a political junkie, I wonder, and this would be a panel discussion all in its own right, but what if 20-some years ago a freelance photographer had been stalking Margaret Pope and then Prime Minister David Lange? New Zealand political history would have changed ineluctably. Would that have been a bad thing?
I think
I'm not going to propose
there
an
might
answer.
have been an element of public interest that could be argued there. But I think we're going to have to save that for another time. That does conclude this discussion. Thanks to David Cohen, Mary Lambie and Professor John Burrows. The government in Chile is still scrambling to respond to Saturday's massive earthquake. The quake and the subsequent risk of a tsunami also provided a test for our own systems and a chance for public radio to make its case. Jose Barbosa has the story.
Hand towels. Hand towels eating my face. That's how I woke up on Sunday morning. But you were probably much more relaxed than that.
In fact, you most likely wandered over to the radio with a cup of tea and thought, it'd be nice to turn on Radio New Zealand and listen to Chris Laidlaw talk about changing notions of haberdashery in post-war Europe. But you flicked on the dial and found gentle Chris had been replaced by a strange, bellowing man.
An official tsunami alert is in effect for New Zealand after a massive 8.8 earthquake struck Chile.
Disturbed, you turned to the telly, hoping to find a relaxing item on a marginalised ethnic magazine show. But instead there was a man who looked like he lived in a space station made out of blue stratos. What the scary man on the radio and the slightly dead-in-the-eyes looking man on the TV were trying to tell you was that a tsunami was on its way. A tsunami created by an 8.8 magnitude earthquake in Chile. And all joking aside, that's one of the biggest ever recorded. To date, it's estimated to have killed over 700 people. Back home, information got out fast. TV1 had live crosses to the Civil Defence Crisis Centre. Radio New Zealand seemed to justify its existence with excellent coverage that used every part of the organisation.
The tsunami started arriving in the eastern part of French Polynesia more than 2 hours ago, and the reports from there, from Rikitea on the island of Mangareva, that the waves were in the range of 50 to 80 centimetres.
By the time the TV breakfast shows muscled in the next morning, the warning had been downgraded. The consensus was that this time, Civil Defence had done its job well. The same couldn't be said for the rest of us.
We still, again, saw people going to beaches to witness a small tsunami.
Yeah, and Paul, that's the stupidity of some of the people in our country, unfortunately.
Which is the only time you'll hear a minister telling the voting public exactly what he thinks of them. Over on Sunrise, Oliver Driver was so primed to take on the Civil Defence Director, he had to hang on to his desk.
How do you send out the warnings? Because there were people in our office that didn't know there was a warning.
Yeah, when no one invites me to a party, I get bummed out too.
Back on breakfast, they still couldn't believe what plonkers people were.
And those people who still insist on going down to the beach and make comments like, when the wave hits, we'll just run for our lives, I thought what an insult to anyone who had been affected by something like that before.
Yeah, you couldn't get much more disrespectful.
To be fair, though...
Oh, wait, hang on.
For the people that go to high points to watch...
Yes.
They will one day, when the big one does come in, provide extra entertainment. The stupid people that go down to the beach, you know what I mean?
And with those wise words, that's our show for this week. Thank you to our guests and to you for watching. We'll be back with Media7 at the same time next week. Until then, goodbye.